Interpretation is when you explain what an artwork is trying to communicate to its viewers. You do this by deciphering, or that is, figuring out or decoding which objects and elements in the artwork function as symbols. And of course, a symbol is an image with an entire set of ideas and concepts that are associated with it. And so a lot of interpretation is based on this game of associations. Thinking about associations, there are some that are extremely easy to consider, like a cross. If you see a cross, it's a obvious symbol for Christianity. Perhaps you think of Jesus himself, or you think of a church, or maybe you think a little bit more distantly and you think of a movie that has a church scene, like this priest who marries Princess Buttercup and her lovely Wesley in The Princess Bride. Or if you see a yin and yang, you might think of a very obvious connection, Lao Tzu, or you might think of their place of worship, a pagoda, or again, somewhat more distantly, you might think of Kung Fu Panda. That's the thing about associations. Some of them are going to be very clear and very obvious, and some of them are going to be a little bit farther down the line. And which one you go with is going to determine oftentimes the strength of your argument. So considering the strength of your argument, we'll do a few more associations. So if you imagine a a white canvas with a painting of an apple on it, what do you associate with an apple? Well, quite immediately you might associate food or an apple tree, which are fairly basic and I would say somewhat shallow associations. But if you think a little bit longer and you think perhaps in a way that's a bit more clever, you may come to consider the apple to be about doctors and health because of the English phrase, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. However, you could also think that it was about teachers and education because of the common cliched idea that you give your teacher an apple on the first day of school or back from a break or what have you. You might also think that it's about New York City, as New York City is also called the Big Apple. If I were to tell you that this apple represents the difference between good and evil and knowing the two, that might not be the most obvious thing to you, but if you are familiar with Western art history or stories from the Bible, the Christian Bible, and the Torah and the Quran, you'll know that Adam and Eve partook of a fruit which had them cast out of the Garden of Eden, and that fruit represented the knowledge of good and evil, the knowledge of the difference between good and evil. And so your associations are going to be quite varied, and one of the ways that you can better defend your interpretations is by considering context clues. So if I take that apple and I make it into an apple tree, well, now it could be about education, it could be about knowledge, it could be about health, it could be about good and evil. If I add in Sir Patrick Stewart, well, now perhaps he is taking knowledge, he is taking health, he's taking control of his health, or maybe he is embarking upon something that will become a sinful thing. And so what you need then are more contexts. You need some clues. So if I put a school behind him, well, then now it does seem like he's taking control of his education, he's engaged in his education, actively pursuing knowledge. If I change the context and I make it a church, well, now we're back into this idea of good and evil, and there are some references there. But remember that interpretation is not only about what is depicted, but how it is depicted. So if I have an artwork that has a lot of sharp lines and sharp angles and high contrast, it's probably more negative than one where everything is smooth and flowy and easily blends from one thing to the other. So if I take this digital collage and I add a gradient on the sky, well, then I'm going to end up with a different context, and that's going to create a different feeling and a different meaning. So do consider all of the clues and all the context when you are making an interpretation. So looking at this artwork and using the things that we've just learned, we have a couple of obvious symbols. For example, the skull is right in the middle and it's a clear symbol of death. That's going to set the context for most of the artwork, because even though there are flowers which are alive to its left, or to the left of the painting, the flowers are cut. They're going to die soon. Beneath the skull is that long white thing. That's a pipe. It's a thing of leisure. It also leads to death. So again, we have another reason why this thing is about death. We have a timepiece behind the skull and in front of the skull. So in front of the skull to the left is a pocket watch, and behind the skull to the right is the top part of an hourglass. The two things to remind us that time is ticking and that life is short. Beyond that, everything else is a thing of luxury. So the nautilus shell to the direct right of the skull, behind the skull with the crystal vases, the gold goblet, the jewelry, and the coins in front, all of this is within the context of that skull, which is saying death. And so the timepieces plus the skull plus the flowers, now we can know that everything in this artwork is trying to make the viewer consider his or her own mortality, and that he or she should definitely engage in the most important things in life, developing relationships with their friends and loved ones. Hopefully now interpretation makes a little bit more sense, and you can use this idea of associations and context clues to do a good job interpreting other works of art.